Good morning, everybody. When we were planning the program and decided that early childhood education was an issue that we should become more aware of because it affects women, families, and our whole economy, I called my sister, who's been a early childhood expert in the U.S. Virgin Islands for about 50 years, and she said I should call the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which I had forgotten about, which I did. And just so you know, the National Association of Education for Young Children promotes high quality early learning for all children, birth through 8, connecting practice, policy, and research. They advance new practices and work with professionals, and they are the national voice of the early childhood education community. And so when I contacted them, we got the name of Laura Hogan, who I'm pleased to introduce to you this morning. But Lauren is the Managing Director of Policy and Professional Advancement of the National Association of Education for Young Children, with responsibility for a portfolio that includes federal and state policy and advocacy, higher education accreditation, professional recognition, and applied research. She has developed and led NAEYC's bipartisan early childhood policy agenda with a keen focus on centering the voices of educators, leadership, innovation, diversity, and equity. She previously served as the Vice President of Programs and Policies at the National Black Child Development Institution. And she has worked in after-school programs and for family support programs. And we are thrilled to have someone with this expertise to talk to us this morning about childcare and COVID, the challenges, the opportunities, and what we can do to help. Lauren, we look forward to hearing from you. I know you're here, so we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much. And hi, everybody. Okay, am I muted or can you hear me?
You're fine.
Okay, the things keep popping up strangely. Hi, good morning, everybody. And thank you all so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and I'm excited to have this conversation with you all. So I'm going to try to share my screen in a minute. I have a few slides that I'm going to use, but feel free to come off mute and ask me questions. Feel free to throw questions into the chat. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat while I'm talking and to make sure that we can engage in a conversation about this important moment for early childhood education and childcare and early learning and what it means for America's children, families, and educators, and our economy at large, and what the pandemic has done to the early childhood education field, both in terms of some of the challenges and opportunities and how important voices just like yours are in making sure that we're able to take significant strides to make things better. It's actually a very interesting day and week to be here with you all. There's a lot happening at the federal level and a lot of opportunity and possibility and a lot of challenges in order to get to all of that opportunity and possibility. And so we'll talk a little bit more about where your voices can really weigh in here and how much we need the support of women, men, families to really weigh in on how important early childhood education is and make sure folks know that. I maybe can't share my screen right now, so I don't know if you can give me the capacity to do that, and I will try. Let's see.
We will make you co-host in a second, as soon as I find you.
Okay, no problem. That's fine.
Yeah, there we go. Your co-host.
Okay, let's try this. Okay. All right. Can y'all see okay? Okay.
Yes.
It's good.
All right, wonderful. Okay, as you've already heard, I am the Managing Director at NAEYC. We do think of early childhood education as birth through age 8, and that's because of the science of early learning, what it tells us about that time period for children. One of the things that we're going to focus on this morning, just as I'm talking about childcare in particular, is I am going to talk mostly about childcare for children birth through age 5. We have lots of work on after school, kids who need childcare in the afternoons, kids who need non-traditional care in the evenings. There's a lot to think about in childcare, but I'm going to focus on childcare that is both care and education. Childcare is very much a workforce support for families who need to go to work, and it is child development. Early learning happens wherever kids are. It doesn't matter what setting they're in. And so in order to deliver on what we know about the importance of early learning, early brain development for kids birth to 5, and to support our current and future workforces, childcare has to be both affordable and high quality, and families have to have equitable access to it regardless of where they are, where they live, whether they want to choose family-based childcare or center-based childcare or schools. There are many different options for families, and we need to make all of those available. To be clear, just because it needs to be both affordable and high quality, right now, mostly it is neither for families. It's neither affordable nor high quality for most families. I'm going to talk just a little bit about, there's lots of different programs that support childcare and early learning, but there's one main federal program that's responsible for it. And that program is called CCDBG. There's no shortage of acronyms in government, as I'm sure most of you know. This one is the Child Care and Development Block Grant. It's basically the major federal program that helps low-income families in particular access childcare by providing states with funding. Just to give you a sense of its scope, more than 1.3 million children from more than 800,000 families received childcare assistance before the pandemic. But the truth is that even before the pandemic, we as a nation have invested so little in childcare compared to nations across the country, compared to what we could be doing. The vast majority of children do not receive the support for which they're eligible. So most kids who are eligible for childcare assistance don't get it. For most families, childcare costs families more than housing or college tuition because of how it is structured, okay? It is expensive for families to afford. In the same way that we don't ask families, but we ask families to shoulder so much of that burden. The other folks who shoulder so much of the burden of the cost of childcare are early childhood educators themselves. Compensation is so low in early childhood education that almost half of them have to access public benefits to help them make ends meet in their own families. So there's a real challenge in childcare in the market, and no less than the Treasury Secretary this week talked about childcare as a broken market in which families have to pay too much and educators don't make enough. And there's no way to sort of bridge this. We don't ask families to pay individually for the cost of 4th grade, the way we ask them to pay individually for the cost of providing childcare for their kids. This is really about making childcare into a collective public good, the way that K-12 education is as well, because of the benefits that it has for children and families and society at large. What we have now is a system that has been misunderstood. Childcare sort of dismissed as babysitting, as daycare, where there is an education that's happening at the same time. It's incredibly undervalued. It's a very female-dominated field. It is very underfunded. These are women who are skilled, valuable, essential workers, and they're not paid or supported as such in our society. I'm going to ask folks, this is back sort of like right when the pandemic started. This is in March of 2020, so like 1,000 years ago. We were seeing a lot of love for teachers on social media. These were just a few that we pulled from the time that were sort of famous folks talking about how much they love teachers. After 2 days of virtual school, I think teachers should make no less than $1 million. We didn't necessarily hang on to this love between parents and teachers for the whole time of the pandemic, but there was this initial sense of like reverence and respect and appreciation for teachers. And one of the things that, came up for us is, question for you guys. Do you think that policymakers and the public remember to think about early childhood educators as teachers? Feel free to throw answers in the chats or toss them out or just thinking to yourself.
As a teacher, I probably don't think that they think very much about them as being educators. Maybe childcare, not educators.
Exactly. Thanks, retired teachers who do think about early childhood educators as teachers too,
Laura?
right?
Well,
Go ahead.
I think that there's like preschools where they might have some concept of that, but if you're talking for a working parent trying to find childcare and it's defined as childcare, I think that that's different than a preschool, which has the name school in it, which is they still don't pay them enough.
Absolutely. And it's a great point, right? We've really not thought of a whole system for children birth through age 8, let alone birth through age 5. We think about preschool and childcare when what we know is that, again, this learning is happening regardless of whether we call it childcare or daycare or preschool. The kind of learning that kids need and helps them thrive is happening in all of those places. And we don't think about early childhood educators as teachers. Maybe folks can get their heads around 4-year-olds, right? But not for the birth to 3 space. Go ahead.
I was a speech pathologist for 10 years. I worked in Montgomery County Public Schools and in Baltimore City Public Schools. And this is one of my great goals in life, which I'll never make, is to teach how to work with children's language starting the day they're born. Because if we could do this for our children, it's more important than college. And they would learn to learn. And we'd have a whole new, absolutely group of people. The whole value of the whole system would change. If we put our money in the beginning, instead of worrying about at the end, we would be wonderful. And then I used to think, well, we could take all these retired teachers and speech therapists, and we could hire them, even if we had to volunteer and go in and teach them how to do this. It would change the world.
It really would. And we'll get to how you guys can use all of this passion and all of this advocacy and all this understanding that I think a lot of folks don't understand and possess about the importance of these early years. I will say there's a good deal of research on the value of K-12 teachers speaking out for early childhood education and as being very trusted resources of information. When teachers, retired teachers, speech language pathologists are able to say, look, I've been there, I get it, I know how important it is to invest in these early years, policymakers can really hear that in an important way. And that voice really helps contribute to moving the conversation. What we know is that skilled and supported and knowledgeable early childhood educators are who provides these high quality early childhood education programs. And that these low wages are undermining that quality, and that compensation is just a huge piece of the puzzle right now. For everybody who knows somebody who's having a hard time finding childcare right now, they're on waiting lists, they're closing classrooms, there's not enough space. That is all comes back to the story around low compensation. There's a million other options for early childhood educators right now, and it's really hard for programs to pay them enough to do this incredibly complex work when they can go across the street to an Amazon warehouse or to a retailer and make a lot more money for not as difficult and demanding as a job that early childhood education can be. Some of the things that we've seen in addition to these staffing crises in the context of COVID. So this, what we've said is COVID created a whole host of challenges for early childhood education, but it was layered on a system that was already broken. And so it really made it took a crisis and made it a catastrophe, essentially. And we have seen in the context of the last 18 months, widespread closures of programs and classrooms. So even if whole programs aren't closing, they're not opening classrooms, they don't have enough teachers to serve enough kids, and so the wait lists are growing. Parents and women in particular are dropping out of the workforce. We have seen a tremendous rollback of women who have young children being able to stay in the workforce. And together, we've also seen sort of increased calls for lower quality standards. When there's not enough spaces, some policymakers tend to resolve that by saying, well, your standards are too high, just lower them down, let anybody do this work, just open the doors, and we just need bodies. We need bodies in classrooms for kids. That is how unsafe situations are created for children. And that's how bad things happen for kids. And so really being able to say, actually, the answer isn't to say like, whoop, anybody can do it, best of luck to you, is to actually invest and make it a job that women can stay in and do and be supported in for their life. One of the other things we're seeing, and I won't talk too much about this, but it's interesting from a birth to age standpoint, when we think about the whole spectrum, we've seen a real difference in how educators working with children 0 to 5, and again, how those working with K-3 are treated. So teachers, revered and lifted up, and educators who showed up throughout this entire pandemic. Many of them kept their programs open so that essential workers could go to work. Just differences in sort of their understanding and how they're treated. You can see on the side, NAIC has been doing surveys of the field since the very, very early days of the pandemic, and have just used that to be able to tell the story to policymakers of what's happening on the ground, the experience of educators in this time and how challenging it's become. And I'm happy to drop the link to all of those in the chat so that you all can see nationally what's going on. And frankly, we have some state data from Maryland as well that we'd be glad to share. On the flip side, because there's always a flip side, the challenges are deep and there are opportunities that are coming out of the pandemic as well. First, there are billions of dollars that are being invested in childcare relief and the potential for hundreds of billions of dollars for childcare and pre-K in a substantial and sustainable way. This has been a fight since Nixon vetoed a universal child care bill exactly 50 years ago in 1971. We have been fighting basically since then to achieve a system that really invests in childcare, paid leave, and in the supports for women and families and young children to really make sure that we can create this supportive system. This is as close as we've gotten since then. And the pandemic and sort of making people aware of the challenges in a new way, can see on the side, increased media attention has been a real part of this. In all my time in the early childhood education field, I've never seen this many like front page media stories on childcare. And that's been the work of advocates and educators really centering their stories and being able to drive some of what's been happening. We see a need to change the status quo. Business leaders are really they are realizing that their workforce can't come to work without childcare. And so they're also saying, we need a systemic childcare fix. We've seen incredible innovation and resilience. We focus a lot on the challenges and the crises and the deep, deep challenges to mental health and well-being that families and educators are experiencing right now. But I also don't want to short shift some of the resilience and some of the innovation that we've seen come out of families and educators, faculty members, kids who have really demonstrated, just incredible bravery and courage and commitment as educators have shown up for kids and families each day of the last 18 months. And again, a real renewed understanding of childcare as essential that has allowed us to really take advantage of this moment when the federal government and Congress are talking about a massive investment in social programs and infrastructure that really will rebuild America, that childcare is at the center of that conversation. The reality is that we can't go back. We're not going back. The impact of the pandemic on childcare has been devastating, but we can't go back to the crisis that was defining our childcare systems before. It was already so fractured and so fragile that this is really a moment to say we have to rebuild this in a stronger and more fundamental way so that we don't wind up here again. There is no answer to the challenge of childcare and early learning that does not involve significant public investments. There is no way to do this with only parents and only educators bearing the burden of it. It's not possible because of the market. It doesn't work. We have to give families equitable access to this affordable, high quality early childhood education. But again, it's not only about affordability for families. It's about making sure that we have well-prepared and well-compensated professionals who reflect the diversity of the children and families that they serve. This is where we get to the question of your advocacy. So you all have the ability, and we've already heard it here today, to tell the story. You all are the experts in your own experience. And I can already hear from some of the conversations and comments that we've seen today, you all have knowledge, whether as teachers or as speech language pathologists, as parents, as community members, as business leaders, really understanding the importance of investing in childcare and early learning. These stories are incredibly powerful. And when we pair them with the data that tells us about the challenges that are being faced in childcare and early learning, when we're able to tell that data and these stories together, we're really able to have policymakers, again, both at the federal level and the state level and your local levels. There's so much great work happening at your city councils, where your school committees are. There's really a need to continue to talk at all levels about the importance of investing in childcare and early learning. This really speaks to, I know you all started, I heard a little bit of just a legislative update, being able, to connect this to what's happening in Maryland, where there has been great strides in things like the Kirwan Commission and sort of other efforts to really invest substantially in childcare and early learning, to make sure your leaders and partners get to know them and that they get to know you. In some ways, the remote aspect of the pandemic has really opened up the ability for a lot of folks to participate in advocacy opportunities that we did not have before. Meetings are being live streamed. Everybody can sort of, comment. We have virtual backgrounds that, can announce sort of who we are and what we do. Being able to show up at these places, because people who care about other issues are doing that. And at the end of the day, advocacy is mostly about making sure the policymakers know where priorities for their constituents are. And for them to hear not only from parents of young kids, for whom it's hard to be advocates because, they're parents of young kids, and that means they have 3-year-olds, and probably it's hard for them to be an advocate because they have to be home at 7 o'clock to put their babies to bed. There's being able to broaden the community that stands up for childcare and early learning is super important. And having just a wide group of people who say, look, I am not in childcare right now, but I know this is important because it's my grandchild or it's my community, and I want this for all kids, is just incredibly meaningful to how policymakers see something as a priority. Everybody's happy to say they like kids and support children. It's whether or not they're held accountable for putting their money where their mouth is that really counts, and knowing that they have people who are looking at them and seeing like, oh, are you doing what you need to do around this issue that's really important to me? I encourage folks to get on Twitter. I won't say everybody needs to get on TikTok just yet. So it's okay. And Twitter though is a lot of places where policymakers look. Facebook is great too. There's a lot of early childhood educators on Facebook. We don't have to go down the road of sort of the challenges of Facebook right now, because there are many. Same for Twitter, frankly. Social media is not always a great place, but it is a great place to follow your elected officials and to let them know how you feel about their positions and what they're doing. It's also a great place to be able to keep up with. So this is the hashtag. If that's a new word to folks, I'll show you. I'm happy to show you. It's called Solve Childcare. And if you look on Twitter for Solve Childcare, you'll be able to see what everybody is recommending in our community around what's happening in early childhood. How to keep track of all the different pieces that are going on. Check out social media as a way to keep track of. There's a lot of other options as well. I really encourage folks to think about how, this is a beautiful community that you all have made already clearly, and being able to hold together, to have these opportunities to talk and connect. I really believe that community is what sustains us right now, whether we're virtual or in person. And this is a hard time for a lot of folks. Being able to come together with fellow educators, advocates, and allies. You have a wonderful NAEYC affiliate in Maryland, the Maryland AEYC, and you can visit the membership page for more. We love having members that are connected to and not directly connected to early childhood education, but just really care about staying connected to the work and to the community at the national level and at your local and state level as well. One of the things when we are getting to know the perspectives of some of your elected officials on childcare is to look at who they are. And you all may know them already. You may come into contact with them for a variety of other issues that are important to you. But to read their bios to get a sense of who they are and why they might care. Do they have young children? Are they grandparents? I cannot tell you how many men I have talked to as policymakers who did not care about childcare or early learning until their daughter had trouble finding childcare. And suddenly they were like, yeah, this is an issue. My daughter and my grandson cannot get into childcare, and I want to know all about it. There's really a way in which these personal connections make a tremendous difference to being able to connect with folks as advocates. These are a couple, places you can look at to research their voting record. It's also really helpful. You have some wonderful champions in Maryland. It's also really great for them to hear a thank you from their constituents on childcare and early learning, for folks to be able to say, I really appreciate that you're making this a priority. And I've noticed that you're making it a priority, and thank you for doing that. Please continue to make it a priority. They do a lot of things that are very thankless, and they all appreciate being held up as a champion for childcare as well. I just want to say, it's important to stay ready. We all have intentions to do good, and there's a time when that needs to become actionable. These are a couple of websites that folks can use to sort of learn more about what's going on and to stay connected in the moment. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a minute so I can see all of you and we can continue to talk a little bit more. I'm going to put in, when I do in the chat, a link to an action alert that we have going on right now that you can just click on immediately. That'll take you to the ability to send an email to your federally elected official, because we are at this incredibly crucial moment. And hi, we are, hey everybody, we are at just an incredibly crucial moment where literally as we speak, there are decisions being made in Congress about whether or not and what the road is going to look like for what would amount to $450 billion for childcare and early learning. This would be a transformational amount of funding and an investment that would really move and advance our system forward in ways that we have needed for a very long time. And it is a crucial moment. We often say, now more than ever, to the point where now more than ever has no meaning. But honestly, this is like a now more than ever moment where we really are in a time where policymakers need to be hearing from their constituents to be able to say, this is the investment that's needed. Do not leave childcare behind. This is why it's important to our children, to our families, to our economy, to the businesses. And we need you to make this kind of investment because of the difference that it will make, broadly speaking, and for everybody. So I will put that chat in, and I would love to talk a little bit more about some of the chats that I've seen coming in.
Lauren, this is Cece Rond. I want to
Hey,
thank you
Cece.
so very much for a great presentation and very informative. And I'm going to try to present to you some of the questions that come from the
Wonderful.
audience. Okay, so Gail Glick says that she's both retired early childhood educator and a grandparent of a 4-year-old. She's always been seeing the need to have quality childcare. And then she asked, how can someone like me advocate for young children? And I think you did bring up quite a few references. And Gail, did that answer your question? Are you okay with that? Where's Gail? Ah, there she is.
Yes.
Okay. And then we have from Sylvia Katzel. My late friend Nancy Tobias was a pre-K teacher for over 30 years. Kindergarten teachers always knew which children she taught because she taught them how to line up, say please and thank you, and how to use tissues. And then I'm not sure this, she says things that parents used to teach children at home. Also, we're supporting schools today with school supplies, and many of us have supported programs to give children backpacks with food for weekends, and I know many of the temples are doing that. And Lisa Jablin says, and ask a question. She says, with so many names for childcare, preschool, learning centers, etc., would a consistent name provide a more coherent object for advocacy?
Lisa, you ask such a great question. So yes, is the probably long and short answer for that question. This is a longstanding issue, I think, in early childhood education, these divisions and how difficult it does make it to advocate for. And I will just say, you know, without getting into sort of a bunch of the details, about 4 years ago, we started an initiative called Power to the Profession, which I can also drop in. And it is continuing to move forward. Basically, over the course of 3 years, about 15 national organizations who represented a stake in the profession and like tens of thousands of early childhood educators engaged in a very long and protracted process to develop a unifying framework for early childhood education that really says this is a workforce supporting children birth through age 8 so that we can move away from all of these fractures. And when policymakers ask questions like, well, how much does an early childhood educator make? Our answer isn't always, it depends, because for the last 50 years, our answer is almost always, it depends. It's like, well, it depends on if you work in this classroom or the one down the hall or the one across the street. And like, by the time you get to the explanation, they've already stopped listening. Being able to really come together in a unified way for advocacy purposes, for funding purposes is incredibly important. And we actually released the unifying framework on March 10th of 2020, literally 2 days before the pandemic sort of hit. And we have been working ever since with states and advocates to really use that framework as part of the roadmap for moving forward. So I'm happy to come back one day and talk more about unifying framework and all those pieces, but it is an incredibly important question and we're working on the big answer to get there.
Thank you. Helene Warrench says, besides the importance of early childhood education, we also need parent education to parents, and I guess that's early childhood educators can work for the betterment of our young people. What is being done? Helene, did I get that?
Yes, yeah, I forgot a word. Parents, the only people we don't train are parents. So besides the early childhood education programs, which are essential for our children to learn and whatever, parents who love their kids mean well, but often don't have the right resources or the right education to be able to do it. So the combination of parents and early childhood educators need to work together. And I want to know what's being done on that level.
Yeah, it's a
Head
great
Start
question.
do that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a great.
Yeah, but that's not enough.
Of course, and it's only for some kids in some places
Right.
and some days. Yeah.
And I think it's really true that I think a lot of, as part of all early childhood education programs, and absolutely Head Start does this tremendously well, but as part of all early childhood education programs, there's an obligation and a responsibility to work with parents, right? To engage families in the work that you're doing, to support families around how their child's development is working. And NAYC, which again, some folks may know, again, some through advocacy, some through our early learning program accreditation. So if you or your kids or your grandkids go to an AC accredited center, that's one way that people know it. NAYC also credits institutions of higher education. And that means we support colleges and universities and identifying and delivering on the competencies to be a high quality early childhood educator. And family engagement is very much one of the things that's built into those competencies. So how do you work with families? How do you support families in their efforts? Head Start does a great job of the comprehensive services. So connecting families to meet their needs. And not all early childhood education programs have that kind of, have those kind of resources, or B, that kind of direction. But we all support things like home visiting programs that really go in and support families as well directly, or paid leave, which also allows families to have those early weeks of bonding with their children that make a tremendous difference over the long term. And that so many of us were fortunate to have ourselves. Really being able to see this whole piece as a continuum. Early childhood education programs are an incredibly important part of the birth through age 8 range, but they're not the only part. Families are an incredibly part, paid leave, all of these pieces come together for a system. And frankly, the US does a terrible job of supporting basically all of them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. So Shulamit Finkelstein's asked this question. What is the status of higher educational institutions regarding teacher training for early education?
Well, thank you for that excellent question. I love talking about higher ed as well. So we actually have, over the last, I would say about 6 months, Rian Evans-Alvin, who's the CEO at NAOIC, has actually conducted about 30 interviews with chancellors and deans of higher education institutions preparing early childhood educators. And, we work closely at NACI with a number of institutions of higher education because of our accreditation program. We have a lot of members who are faculty members. So we work a lot within the higher ed space. And they too, similarly to early childhood educators, are struggling with people not wanting to enter into the early childhood education field because of the low compensation that they're going to receive on the other end. It is very difficult to convince somebody that they need to go get a degree in early childhood education because of the competencies, so that they can go from making $10.60 an hour to making $10.75 an hour. That's bonkers. Like, you can't expect people to do that and stay within this system. And so they really too identified, we got to fix this compensation question. We have to be able to make this, we love preparing early childhood educations, and institutions, including community colleges at the associate's degree level, who are an integral part of this work, as well as bachelor's, as well as master's degrees, because we're going to have folks retiring from faculty. We're going to have we're going to need even more people than we already have at a time when we're already losing people. Really being able to make this an attractive, viable, supported profession is crucial. And the institutions of higher education are an incredibly important part of that whole picture.
Thank you. Linda Buteyek has a kind of a long comment, but she has a question at the end. She says, we certainly need to look at children as a whole person. There are many services such as health, mental health, social supports. Children can't learn if they're hungry and not well, or if there is violence in the home. Is this addressed in the child care bill?
It's a great question. And Linda and I have a connection through her daughter, who I have the opportunity to work with as well on a lot of these issues. So it's absolutely right that children don't come in silos any more than any of us do. Like they cannot learn when they're hungry. Medicaid and is an incredibly important part of this. ACA, the Affordable Care Act, is an incredibly important part of this. Really thinking about how we support children and families in meeting all of their comprehensive needs. In the bill in particular, there's a lot in there that addresses things like Medicaid expansion, SNAP, which are food stamps, and being able to address children's needs around child nutrition and around investments that really support their families' health and well-being, as well as their mental health and well-being. We see, much to be done around the need for trauma-informed care and really thinking about the investments that address the trauma that kids are experiencing right now, both in the context of the pandemic and far beyond that. I mean, in the context of, I mean, you mentioned violence in the home, violence in communities as well. We're really seeing just tremendous struggles, and have for a long time, about what kids are facing and what their families are facing as well. So there is a lot else in the bill, this very big, broad, not just the childcare portion of it, but the very big, broad bill that we don't know exactly how big or broad it's going to be as of this very moment. But to really think about all of those different pieces of kids' needs and strengths, and being able to really build on that, so that it isn't just about sort of fixing what's wrong, but actually building on the assets that they have and what's right, and being able to support them and their families as well.
Thank you. Anyone else have any questions?
Yes. I have a comment. For many years, I was a public school administrator in Pittsburgh, and this is years going back, but I don't see any changes in how we are trying to identify these young people. Linda hit on it a little bit, and so did you, on abuse. This is such a big deal, and it's growing and growing. And what are your preschool people trained to do when this happens? And are they trained?
I think Lisa has a comment, and then I'll weigh in as well. Go ahead, Lisa.
I was a school nurse for 15 years. There are many people, maybe not when you were, Devorah, the principal in Pittsburgh, but now that Maryland has a law that there are mandated reporters. Every school teacher, anyone who comes in contact with a child, is a mandated reporter to Department of Social Services in that county. If there's a suspicion, just even a suspicion of abuse or neglect, it's not up to me as the nurse to document the abuse or neglect. It's up to me to report it and let the child service workers, and the same is true in nursing homes for adult protective services. It's up to the protective service worker to do the investigation and perhaps involve the police and perhaps remove the child for safety until everything is figured out. But it's
I just have one more
the-
comment. What are we doing for preschool? We're talking about kids before they get to that level.
No, those teachers are mandated reporters as well.
Okay.
Everyone who comes in contact with a child, whether it's a Parks and Recreation football program, whether it's pre-K, whether it's a ballet program, whether it's a college gymnastics program training Olympic gymnasts, anyone who comes in contact is a mandated reporter.
Yeah, I would also weigh in.
Thank you.
When I was a teacher in Baltimore City, they had courses that teachers had to take in the school that was dealing with mandated reporter, that it told you what you had to do. And if you suspected any little thing, it doesn't need to be proof. It's just a thought that something is wrong. You had to report it. Otherwise you could get into trouble.
You could be arrested and lose your license.
Yes,
Right.
you could come back to you, but, oh, you didn't see this, whatever. So we are all trained as teachers to recognize this situation.
Also say, I think it has a lot to do with the previous questions too, around working with families and how, NAOIC, for example, we have a code of ethics that, as part of being early childhood educators and going through the institutions of higher education, folks learn about what the code of ethics says about your obligations to children, your obligations to understand families and their community and cultural contexts, and what it means to really think about what happens when you suspect abuse or neglect. And yes, you're a mandated reporter, that's, and you're trained to sort of do some of this, but they're stressed, they're underpaid themselves. What happens when they call foster care? Is it going to be better? What is the foster care system going to say about what happens to kids? There's a lot of implications that they themselves have to take into account, really navigating through that, always with the safety of the child at the forefront. But we have a forum for educators, an open forum. And I will say, we see questions like this all the time from educators to each other. Like, is this, what do I do about this moment? They're really ethical conundrums in some ways for folks to be able to walk through, and to be able to making those decisions without a context of support for their own well-being is incredibly difficult, and fits into all of these conversations about why we need to make these investments.
The Department of Social Services in Baltimore County has noticed a huge uptick in child abuse that shows up in emergency rooms. Does not, because schools have been closed. The nurse has usually been the conduit to the Department of Social Services when seeing something, or a teacher saying, hey, look at Charlie. And my job was generally to hold the hand of the teacher who was making the call. I could not make the call for the teacher. The person who initiates the suspicion has to make the call, but I would hold her hand while she did it, while she was shaking, thinking, how am I going to deal with these parents when I see them at the PTA meeting tomorrow night?
Okay, do we have any other questions?
Yeah, this is Helene. I have a whole nother area that I don't know. My background is early childhood from years ago, but years ago, when the economy got very strong and companies were making a lot of money and couldn't find employees, they were investing in early childhood. Some of them opened their own programs, some of them gave benefits and whatever. Are we encouraging companies who are, and is it working or is it not working, to have companies provide either on-site or benefits or whatever that would help families so they could go to work?
I see. Oh, you're gonna put me in the middle of some lively debates, huh? Okay. So there's
always
there's definitely some questions about there. So there are companies that have done great work for their employees, and some of those are pretty well known. Patagonia has a long history of doing really great childcare on site and for all employees. Some employers have done a great job of having, being able to subsidize their parents having access to childcare. There is a role, I believe, for me, I believe there is a role for employers in contributing to an early childhood education and childcare system that really allows them to support. I worry a little bit that tying childcare only to employment undermines the ways in which early childhood education is also a child development support. So,
right.
Part of the problem with having low wages in early childhood education is that there's turnover. And turnover is bad, not just because it's hard for the program and the employer, but because it's hard on kids. It's a stability in the relationship building is partly where those benefits for kids come from in early childhood education. And if it's dependent on their parents' work, they lose a job, they get pulled from their childcare setting. That's also undermining that child development aspect. So I'd love to see corporations and employers sort of advocate for a tax structure that really makes enough of a revenue system that can support everybody. That said, also having it be a benefit where they can support the community-based childcare around them, where they have on-site childcare that is good for not just the top level headquarters employees, but everybody in their entire workforce, whether that's warehouses, those are also good things. And they can really bring together. I think I've seen it work really well in some employers where it's nice and supportive to have your CEO and the CEO's assistant have their kids in the exact same program, and what that does for the sort of morale and support of a company and the kids as well.
Yeah, it's a slope, but it provides education that otherwise may not be provided.
Absolutely.
Following up to that, I just read an article that the armed services, I think, had like 20 years ago or something, started investing in childcare. Has anyone looked at that model, and how is that? They said it was a success, but I wanted to
It
get your
is.
take on it.
The military model is one of the best models we actually have for childcare. It is the most functional childcare system that we have in the United States.
Wow.
It is in
That's
part
impressive.
because it's really good, and they're all required to be NACE accredited. It is in part because it is about probably 30 years ago now that they had a system that looked much like our nation's system right now. Generally speaking, it was not great. And they really took the time and the funding to invest in it, because the military said, we cannot support our troops unless they have kind of high quality childcare that allows them to go to work. And they do create an incredible model for how payment structures work, for what kind of quality they can support, for how they pay their educators. We have raised this to many, 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 many federal policymakers that we have a model for this. We don't have to make it up out of whole cloth. Sometimes that's a compelling argument for folks and other times not. But there is a really great model. And I think the proof, sometimes I think, when we focus a lot of the challenges, people end up saying, well, maybe there's nothing we can do about it anyway. This sounds really rough. And I think the idea that it can be both difficult and solvable, and we have proof of that, the military has done it, is a really important point to be able to drive home for policymakers. It is difficult. It is also not impossible to change. We actually know a lot about how to make the system better. And yes, it does take substantial funding up front, but we know that it will be worth it in the end. We already know how much of a return on investment we get for childcare and early learning. Just being able to show that there's a path forward is really helpful.
Yeah, Lauren, we could go on for a while. Questions. So I just have one question before we end.
Sure.
And it really isn't a question, it's a comment. In a school that I taught at high school, it was they had career paths. And they had one career path was early childhood. And they actually had kids, I had young children coming in. They're called We Little Foresters. And the school was Forest Park High School. It's a known school in Baltimore City. And it was wonderful to see young kids, high school kids, learning what it takes to be a early childhood education teacher. And they taught, they learned, they experienced it firsthand with children. I thought it was wonderful, but at the same time, unfortunately, it ended. Yeah, the teacher who was teaching them, she more said she unfortunately in education, she said I was treated better in the outside world in business than in education. So she ended up leaving, and they got no one else to pick it up. But it was a great experience for those kids that experienced very young learning about early childhood, and that a lot of them went into education because of that. So
it does still exist. There are states that still have high school programs where they earn what's called their CDA, which is sort of the entry level credential.
Yes.
And then they can use that to convert to, credits at the associate's level degrees. So they do still exist, but you're right. They're not nearly as widespread as they could be.
No, it isn't. But anyway, we want to thank you for enlightening us, giving us information that we can take back to our organizations and be more proactive in this situation that we would all, I think everyone here would love to see improved, but only time will tell, correct? So
That's right.
thank you again for being.
Thank you all. Thank you for having me.